The Luftwaffe pilot checked his instruments one final time before beginning his dive. Below him, spread across the English countryside in the dim light of approaching dawn, lay exactly what intelligence had promised: a fully operational Royal Air Force fighter base. He could see the hangars, the dispersed aircraft positioned around the perimeter, the fuel storage tanks, the control tower. Even from 3,000 feet, the target looked pristine, untouched by previous raids, which meant the aircraft and facilities below represented genuine operational capability that needed to be destroyed. His squadron had been briefed thoroughly. This base, one of several protecting the approaches to London, was launching fighters that were making daytime bombing raids increasingly costly. Destroying the aircraft on the ground, eliminating the fuel supplies, cratering the runways, these objectives would give German bomber formations precious hours or days of reduced fighter opposition. The strategic value was obvious. He pushed the stick forward and felt the Junkers Ju-88 respond, entering the controlled dive that would deliver his payload with precision onto the target below. Around him, other aircraft from his staffel followed, each pilot selecting targets, each bombardier preparing to release ordnance that would transform the airfield from operational asset to smoking ruin. The bombs fell in sequence, arcing downward through the morning air. The pilot pulled up from his dive, felt the aircraft strain against the G-forces, leveled out and turned to observe the results. He'd made these attacks before. He knew what to expect: explosions, fire, secondary detonations as fuel stores ignited, smoke rising from shattered buildings and burning aircraft. What he saw instead was bombs detonating against empty fields. Explosions that threw up dirt and grass. Hangars that, as smoke and debris cleared, revealed themselves to be painted canvas over wooden frames. Aircraft that weren't aircraft at all, just crude shapes made from wood and fabric that from altitude had appeared convincing but at ground level were obviously decoys. Fuel tanks that contained nothing. Buildings that were hollow shells. A complete airbase that wasn't a base at all, just an elaborate theatrical production designed to look operational from exactly the altitude and angles that attacking aircraft would observe it. Over the next 18 months, German and Italian air forces would drop more than 2,000 bombs on targets exactly like this one. Dummy airfields constructed with such attention to detail that pilots, bombardiers, and intelligence analysts all believed they were attacking genuine military installations. Bombs that could have destroyed real aircraft instead destroyed plywood and canvas. Missions that could have degraded British air defense capabilities instead achieved nothing except confirming to Allied commanders that their deceptions were working precisely as designed. This is the story of how Britain defended itself not with anti-aircraft guns or fighter interceptors, but with paint and lumber, with understanding of human perception and exploitation of enemy intelligence procedures. How the most effective defense wasn't one that destroyed attacking aircraft but one that made those aircraft waste their weapons on targets that looked real but weren't. How empty fields became weapons more valuable than the bases they pretended to be. Because in the desperate summer and autumn of 1940, when Britain stood essentially alone against Axis air power that sought to destroy the Royal Air Force as prelude to invasion, survival depended not just on fighting effectively but on making the enemy fight ineffectively, attacking targets that didn't matter, expending resources on objectives that existed only to be attacked, believing their raids were succeeding when they were achieving nothing. The invisible weapon was perfectly visible from the air. That was the entire point. It had to look real enough to draw attacks, detailed enough to withstand the scrutiny of reconnaissance photography, convincing enough that pilots would commit ordnance to destroying it. And it had to be built quickly, cheaply, and in sufficient numbers that even when some deceptions were discovered, the overall program would continue protecting the real installations that actually mattered. The program that would eventually create dozens of dummy airfields across Britain began not with elaborate planning but with desperate improvisation. In the spring of 1940, as German forces swept through France and Belgium, British military planners faced an unpleasant mathematical reality. The Royal Air Force had finite resources, limited numbers of aircraft, pilots, airfields, fuel supplies, maintenance facilities. German air forces, once they secured bases in occupied France, would be able to strike British installations with relatively short flight times and heavy bomb loads. If those attacks destroyed aircraft on the ground, eliminated fuel supplies, or cratered runways at operational bases, British defensive capabilities would degrade rapidly. Fighter Command, responsible for defending British airspace, operated from a network of bases positioned to provide overlapping coverage. Losing even a few bases to sustained attack would create gaps in coverage that German bombers could exploit. The conventional response would be to defend bases with anti-aircraft artillery and fighter patrols. But this was expensive in terms of resources and not entirely effective. AA guns required personnel, ammunition, and positioning that made them vulnerable to suppression. Fighter patrols consumed fuel and pilot time that reduced availability for actual interception missions. Neither defense was perfect. Some attacks would inevitably succeed, and over time accumulated damage would reduce operational capability. What emerged from discussions among RAF officers, civil defense planners, and a small group of civilian contractors was a radically different approach. Instead of trying to prevent all attacks on real bases, create false bases that would draw attacks away from genuine installations. The concept wasn't entirely novel. Military forces had used decoys and camouflage throughout history. But the scale being considered was unprecedented. Not just isolated dummy positions but complete fake airfields, constructed with sufficient detail that aerial reconnaissance would identify them as legitimate targets, maintained continuously so they'd remain convincing over time, positioned strategically to protect real bases by offering alternative targets. The man who would coordinate this effort was Colonel John Turner, an engineer who understood both construction and deception. Turner recognized that creating convincing dummy installations required understanding what made real installations visible from the air and then replicating those signatures using the cheapest possible methods. Real airfields had characteristic features: runways or landing strips, hardstands where aircraft were parked, hangars and maintenance buildings, fuel storage, control towers, perimeter tracks connecting everything. From altitude, these features created distinctive patterns that trained photo interpreters could identify immediately. Creating dummy airfields meant reproducing those patterns in ways that would satisfy photo analysis while using minimal resources. The construction techniques developed for dummy airfields reveal the intersection between military necessity and theatrical craftsmanship. Runways on dummy fields weren't paved. They were existing fields where grass had been mowed or cut away to create the appearance of prepared surfaces. From 3,000 feet, the difference between grass and pavement wasn't visible in reconnaissance photographs. What mattered was the pattern: a long strip cleared of vegetation, aligned with prevailing winds, of appropriate dimensions for the aircraft types supposedly using the field. Hangars were constructed from wooden frames covered with painted canvas or burlap. The key wasn't making them withstand close inspection but making them photograph correctly. The dimensions had to match real hangars. The positioning had to be logical, placed where real hangars would be with appropriate spacing. The painting had to simulate the appearance of metal or concrete structures when viewed from above. Aircraft were the most challenging elements to simulate convincingly. Early attempts used crude wooden shapes that looked nothing like real aircraft once bombs revealed their true nature. But the deception program learned and adapted. Later dummy aircraft were constructed with attention to dimensional accuracy, using techniques borrowed from film set design. Wings, fuselage, tail assembly, each component was built to correct scale and assembled to match how real aircraft looked when parked. Some dummy aircraft even included movable parts, control surfaces that could be positioned differently to suggest active use. This prevented reconnaissance photographs from showing identical positions that might indicate the aircraft were static displays rather than operational machines. The attention to detail extended to what film designers would call set dressing, the small elements that make scenes believable. Dummy airfields included vehicles that appeared to be moving between buildings, fuel trucks positioned at hardstands, even personnel, actually painted shapes positioned to look like ground crew working on aircraft when photographed from altitude. What made these deceptions particularly sophisticated was that they changed over time. New dummy aircraft would appear. Others would be repositioned to different hardstands. Buildings showed wear patterns. The fields evolved in ways consistent with how operational bases evolved, preventing static appearances that might suggest the installations weren't genuine. But visual deception alone wasn't sufficient. German intelligence would cross-reference reconnaissance photographs with other information sources, and if those sources contradicted what photos showed, the deception would be compromised. This required creating what intelligence professionals call multi-source verification, ensuring that every way German intelligence might examine the dummy airfields would confirm they were genuine rather than expose them as false. Radio traffic was crucial. Real RAF bases generated constant communications: aircraft operations, logistics coordination, maintenance scheduling, administrative chatter. Dummy bases needed to generate similar traffic if German signals intelligence was monitoring frequencies associated with RAF operations. This was handled by small teams operating radio equipment from locations near dummy fields, transmitting on frequencies and using call signs that would appear to be associated with the supposed base. The traffic didn't need to contain genuine operational information. It just needed to sound authentic, to match the patterns of military communication that German signals analysts would expect. Vehicle traffic was another verification source. German agents or aerial reconnaissance might note roads leading to installations and observe traffic patterns. Dummy fields needed to show appropriate activity, vehicles arriving and departing, supply convoys, transport associated with operational bases. This was accomplished through careful routing of legitimate military traffic. Convoys that needed to travel through areas anyway would be directed past dummy installations, creating the appearance of bases receiving supplies. The timing and frequency were calibrated to match what would be expected for bases of the indicated size and activity level. Even civilian reports were considered. German intelligence maintained networks in Britain, much less extensive than Axis Command believed but present. Reports from these sources might reach German intelligence about bases in certain locations. The dummy fields were positioned in areas where such reports would seem credible, where the presence of RAF installations would make military sense given broader defensive requirements. The deception operated at multiple levels simultaneously. Visual evidence from reconnaissance photography. Electronic evidence from radio intercepts. Human intelligence from agents and civilian sources. Traffic analysis from observed vehicle movements. Each information stream confirmed what the others suggested, that operational RAF bases existed at these locations. The first major test of this deception came during what history would record as the Battle of Britain, the sustained German air campaign aimed at destroying British air defense capabilities. Beginning in July 1940, Luftwaffe forces launched increasingly heavy attacks against British airfields, radar installations and aircraft production facilities. The strategic objective was clear: eliminate RAF fighter capability, achieve air superiority, enable the invasion of Britain that German planners had designated Operation Sea Lion. RAF Fighter Command fought desperately during these months, but the mathematics were concerning. German forces could sustain losses and replace them from production and training pipelines that exceeded British capacity. If the battle became simple attrition, trading aircraft and pilots until one side couldn't continue, Britain would eventually lose. What kept the balance manageable was that German attacks weren't concentrating exclusively on targets that mattered. Reconnaissance had identified dozens of airfields across southern England. Intelligence suggested many were operational fighter bases. Luftwaffe planners distributed attacks across these targets, seeking to overwhelm defenses and systematically degrade British capability. What they didn't know was that a significant percentage of targets being attacked were dummies. The bombs falling on these installations destroyed nothing of military value. The missions flown to attack them consumed fuel, ordnance, and pilot time that could have been directed against genuine targets. The intelligence reporting these attacks as successful was systematically overestimating the damage being inflicted on British capabilities. Colonel Turner's teams, monitoring which dummy installations were being attacked, could assess which deceptions were succeeding. When a dummy field came under attack, it confirmed that German intelligence had accepted the installation as genuine. The bomb damage would be photographed by German reconnaissance, confirming the attack had succeeded, while providing British intelligence with proof the deception was working. What made the strategic impact profound was scale. Over the critical months of the Battle of Britain, hundreds of bombing missions were directed at dummy installations. The ordnance expended represented thousands of bombs that didn't damage operational British capabilities. The pilot time consumed represented hundreds of sorties that didn't degrade actual defenses. This wasn't the only factor in British survival during this period. Fighter pilot skill, radar technology, intelligence from signals intercepts all contributed. But the dummy airfield program created a quantifiable diversion of German effort toward targets that didn't matter, at a time when British margins were so thin that even marginal advantages were potentially decisive. The German response to discovering some installations were dummies reveals the psychological complexity of military deception. By late 1940, some Luftwaffe pilots and intelligence officers had begun suspecting certain targets might be false. Attacks that produced no secondary explosions despite hitting supposed fuel storage. Buildings that collapsed in ways inconsistent with substantial construction. Aircraft that burned with smoke patterns suggesting wood rather than aviation fuel. But these suspicions created a dilemma for German intelligence. Some airfields were dummies, which ones? How could you distinguish between genuine and false installations when the false ones were deliberately constructed to match every observable characteristic of genuine ones? The obvious approach, attack everything until you determine through damage assessment what's real, was exactly what the deception was designed to encourage. Bombing dummy fields to confirm they were dummies meant expending resources to destroy targets that didn't matter, which served British purposes whether German intelligence ultimately discovered the deception or not. The alternative, assume everything might be false and attack nothing, was strategically impossible. Genuine RAF bases existed and needed to be attacked to achieve German operational objectives. Paralyzing German offensive operations out of fear that targets might be false would hand Britain victory without British forces needing to do anything. This left German planners in what game theorists would call a strategic bind. They had to attack British airfields to achieve their objectives. Some airfields were definitely genuine. Some were possibly false. Distinguishing between them with certainty was difficult or impossible using available intelligence methods. Therefore, they had to attack targets knowing some percentage were probably dummies, accepting this as a cost of ensuring they also attacked the genuine installations that needed to be destroyed. The dummy airfield program had created a situation where German forces couldn't win. If they attacked targets indiscriminately, they wasted resources on dummies. If they became too cautious about target selection, they failed to adequately attack genuine installations. Either way, British defensive capabilities were preserved longer than they would have been without the deception. The technical sophistication of the dummy installations evolved throughout the war as both sides adapted to each other's capabilities. Early dummy fields had been crude by later standards, convincing enough for 1940 reconnaissance technology but vulnerable to more detailed analysis. As German photo interpretation became more sophisticated, British deception had to match that sophistication. One advancement was incorporating bomb damage. When dummy fields were attacked, the damage wasn't simply left as is. Teams would repair some damage while leaving other damage visible, matching how real bases conducted damage control. Craters would be filled on runways to restore operational capability. Damaged buildings would be cleared or rebuilt. This created temporal continuity that suggested ongoing operations rather than static displays. Another refinement was adding defenses. Real airfields had anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, shelters, all visible in reconnaissance photography. Dummy fields needed equivalent defenses to be convincing. This led to the creation of dummy AA positions using painted wood to simulate guns, dummy balloons made from fabric, shelters that were actually shallow excavations covered with painted canvas. Some installations even included dummy damage from supposed previous attacks, creating backstories that suggested these bases had been hit before, sustained damage, and been repaired. This explained why some structures might look newer than others, why certain areas showed recent construction, maintaining the narrative that these were active military installations with operational histories. The most sophisticated deceptions incorporated what modern designers would call environmental storytelling, arranging elements to suggest activities and events beyond what was directly visible. Paths worn between buildings by foot traffic. Areas where grass was worn away by vehicle movements. Debris accumulation in areas where maintenance occurred. These subtle details, invisible in most reconnaissance photography but occasionally visible in high-resolution images, reinforced the impression that these were living, operational facilities rather than static constructions. The human cost of the deception program reveals dimensions of the operation that pure strategic analysis doesn't capture. The teams maintaining dummy installations worked under conditions where enemy attack was not just possible but desired. The entire purpose was to draw attacks. Workers on dummy fields knew they were at risk from bombs intended to destroy what they were pretending to maintain. The calculation was that dummy fields were safer than real fields because they didn't contain aviation fuel, ammunition, or other explosives that created secondary dangers when hit. But bombs were still bombs, and splinters from detonations didn't distinguish between dummy and genuine targets. Several workers were killed or injured during attacks on dummy installations. These casualties represented a dark irony of the program. People dying while successfully deceiving the enemy into attacking empty fields. The deaths were statistically fewer than would have occurred if those same bombs had hit real bases, but that statistical victory provided no consolation to the individuals who paid the price for the deception's success. There was also psychological burden on the teams creating and maintaining these installations. They were engaged in elaborate theater where the audience was trying to kill them, where success meant being attacked, where their craftsmanship was measured by how many bombs enemy forces wasted on their constructions. This created a strange inversion of normal work satisfaction. You wanted your creation to be destroyed because destruction meant the deception had succeeded. For Luftwaffe pilots who eventually discovered they'd been attacking dummies, there was anger and humiliation. They'd risked their lives, watched squadron mates die, expended effort and resources, all while attacking targets that weren't real. The psychological impact of realizing you'd been systematically deceived, that your courage and skill had been exploited to waste your effort, created resentment that persisted long after the war ended. The strategic impact of the dummy airfield program becomes clearer when examining specific engagements where attacks were diverted from genuine targets. During August 1940, Luftwaffe forces launched a series of heavy raids intended to destroy Fighter Command's operational capacity. German intelligence had identified what they assessed as the primary fighter bases defending southeastern England. Attack plans distributed forces across these targets with the objective of inflicting simultaneous damage that would overwhelm British repair and recovery capabilities. What German planners didn't know was that approximately 30% of targets on their lists were dummies. The attacks on these installations succeeded perfectly, bombs hit targets, damage was observed and photographed, intelligence assessments reported bases severely damaged or destroyed. But none of this affected British operational capacity because the bases being destroyed didn't exist. The genuine fighter bases, receiving 70% of the attack weight rather than 100%, sustained damage but remained operational. Runways were cratered but repaired within hours. Some aircraft were destroyed, but not in numbers sufficient to degrade squadron strength below operational thresholds. British fighter capability, while strained, remained intact. Had those same attacks been concentrated entirely on genuine bases, had the 30% of effort wasted on dummies been added to attacks on real targets, the damage might have been sufficient to temporarily ground squadrons, prevent effective fighter response to subsequent bomber raids, create the air superiority window German planners sought. This hypothetical can't be proven definitively, but the mathematics are suggestive. German forces during this period were operating near the limits of their capability. They had finite numbers of aircraft and pilots available for operations on any given day. Distributing those finite resources across both genuine and dummy targets meant genuine targets received less attention than they would have otherwise. The margin between British survival and defeat during this period was narrow enough that even marginal diversions of German effort potentially changed outcomes. The dummy airfield program created exactly such marginal diversions, consistently over months of sustained operations. The program's expansion beyond simple airfields reveals how successful deception often grows in scope once initial concepts prove effective. By late 1940, the deception program had expanded to include dummy factories, fuel depots, ports, and other installations that German forces might target. The techniques remained similar: create visual signatures that matched genuine installations, support with appropriate radio traffic and activity patterns, position strategically to protect real installations by offering alternative targets. Dummy factories were particularly sophisticated. These weren't just buildings painted to look like manufacturing facilities. They included lighting patterns visible at night that suggested industrial activity, smokestacks that produced smoke at times consistent with shift operations, vehicle traffic that suggested shipping of materials and products. Some dummy facilities were even designed to show specific types of production. A dummy aircraft factory would have roof configurations matching actual aircraft plants, rail sidings appropriate for receiving materials and shipping completed aircraft, security measures consistent with sensitive military production. German intelligence, analyzing these facilities, would conclude they represented genuine production capacity and designate them for attack. The strategic value was similar to dummy airfields. Bombs falling on fake factories didn't reduce British production capacity. But there was an additional psychological dimension. German leadership needed to believe their strategic bombing campaign was degrading British industrial capacity. Reports of successful attacks on production facilities supported narratives about German air power effectiveness and British industrial vulnerability. Maintaining these narratives through attacks on dummy facilities served British strategic communication objectives. If German leadership believed bombing was more effective than it actually was, they might continue campaigns that weren't achieving objectives rather than adjusting strategy to more effective approaches. The intelligence dimension of the deception reveals how it functioned as much through information management as through physical construction. British intelligence services, having broken certain German codes and monitoring Luftwaffe radio traffic, could often determine which installations German forces believed were genuine targets. This created opportunities to deliberately feed intelligence to German sources that would reinforce false beliefs about dummy installations. The double-cross system, British intelligence's program of controlling German agents operating in Britain, was particularly valuable. Agents who German intelligence believed were loyal and providing accurate information were actually British-controlled and providing information Britain wanted Germany to receive. These controlled agents would report on dummy installations as if they were genuine, confirming locations, describing observed activity, providing details that matched what German reconnaissance would photograph. Their reports gave German intelligence human source confirmation of what aerial photography suggested, creating multi-source verification that the installations were real. What made this particularly effective was that controlled agents occasionally provided accurate information that German forces could verify independently. This established credibility. The accurate information about genuine targets made their false information about dummy targets more believable. German intelligence, seeing that agents' reports about real installations were correct, naturally assumed reports about dummy installations were equally accurate. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where each information source confirmed others. Reconnaissance photographs showed installations. Radio intercepts suggested activity at those installations. Human sources confirmed the installations were operational. Each verification method appeared to validate the others, and none could be easily dismissed because all were providing consistent information. The only way to break this cycle was to discover the deception at one level and then question whether all levels might be compromised. But this level of systemic doubt, assuming all intelligence sources might be providing false information, would paralyze decision-making. German intelligence had to trust some sources, and the sources they trusted were providing information that confirmed dummy installations were genuine. The eventual discovery of the deception scope by German intelligence reveals how difficult it was to reverse the effects even after the deception was understood. By 1941, German intelligence had accumulated enough evidence to recognize that Britain was conducting extensive dummy installation programs. Luftwaffe personnel had examined bomb damage and found clear indications of wooden construction, painted canvas, decoy aircraft. Intelligence assessments acknowledged the presence of mock installations in Britain. But this recognition didn't eliminate the strategic impact. German forces still needed to attack British airfields, factories, and other targets. They still couldn't reliably distinguish between genuine and dummy installations before committing to attacks. Reconnaissance photographs of dummy installations looked essentially identical to photographs of genuine installations of similar types. This meant German planners faced an ongoing dilemma. They could attack targets knowing some percentage were dummies, accepting wasted effort as inevitable. Or they could be more selective, but risk missing genuine targets that needed to be destroyed. Neither option was satisfying, and both represented partial victories for British deception. Some German responses involved more thorough reconnaissance, multiple photographic passes at different altitudes and angles, analysis by experienced interpreters looking for subtle indications of false construction. But this consumed resources and time, and wasn't perfectly reliable. The dummy installations had been designed specifically to withstand exactly this type of scrutiny. Other responses involved simply accepting higher evidentiary thresholds before designating targets for attack. But this meant fewer attacks overall, which served British objectives by reducing pressure on genuine installations. The deception succeeded not just when it drew attacks to dummy targets but also when it made German forces more cautious about attacking any targets. The long-term influence of this deception program on military doctrine reveals how profoundly it changed thinking about defensive operations. The traditional concept of defense involved preventing or reducing enemy attacks through active measures: anti-aircraft fire, fighter interception, physical hardening of targets. The dummy installation program demonstrated an alternative defensive approach: make the enemy's attacks less effective by offering false targets that consume attack resources while protecting genuine assets. This principle, defensive deception through presenting false targets, became incorporated into military planning across multiple nations in subsequent decades. Soviet military doctrine during the Cold War emphasized maskirovka techniques that included extensive use of dummy installations to protect genuine military assets. Western forces developed similar capabilities, recognizing that making enemy targeting less accurate could be as valuable as traditional active defenses. The concept extended beyond physical dummy installations to electronic deception, where false radar signatures or communications could draw attention or attacks away from genuine assets. Modern military forces continue using decoys, false signatures, and deceptive positioning as routine defensive measures. What the British dummy airfield program proved was that defense didn't require destroying attacking forces or preventing their attacks entirely. It could succeed by making those attacks less effective, by manipulating enemy intelligence and targeting processes so that attacks hit the wrong targets or were distributed less effectively across genuine targets. This was a fundamentally different way of thinking about defense, not as preventing damage but as controlling where damage occurred, ensuring it fell on assets you could afford to lose while protecting assets you couldn't afford to lose. There's a photograph that survived from this period, taken by German reconnaissance in August 1940, showing what appears to be a fully operational RAF fighter base. You can see aircraft dispersed around the perimeter, hangars with their distinctive roof patterns, a control tower, fuel storage tanks. Everything suggests an active military installation worth attacking. Intelligence analysts examining this photograph would have identified multiple targets worth destroying, the aircraft especially, but also the facilities and infrastructure that supported operations. What you can't see in the photograph, what no amount of photographic analysis could reveal, is that the aircraft were wood and canvas, the hangars were painted fabric over frames, the fuel tanks were empty shells. The installation was designed specifically to be photographed from exactly this angle and altitude, to be analyzed by exactly this methodology, and to be deemed a legitimate target worthy of attack. Somewhere in archives may exist photographs taken after this installation was attacked, showing bomb damage, destroyed buildings, cratered runways. German intelligence would have used these post-strike photographs to assess bomb damage and confirm mission success. They would have marked this base as destroyed or heavily damaged, as no longer capable of operational sorties that would interfere with subsequent German raids. And they would have been entirely correct, except that the base had never been capable of operational sorties because it had never been a real base at all. Their accurate assessment of successful destruction was simultaneously a complete intelligence failure, failing to recognize that success in destroying the target meant nothing because the target had no military value. The story of Britain's dummy airfields ultimately reveals something profound about the nature of warfare in the modern era. Wars have always involved deception, feints, camouflage, false information designed to mislead adversaries. But the industrialization of warfare brought industrialization of deception. What had been occasional stratagems became systematic programs conducted with dedicated resources and professional expertise. The dummy airfield program represented warfare in the domain of perception and belief. The physical installations were almost incidental. What mattered was what German intelligence believed about them, what German planners decided based on those beliefs, how German forces distributed effort based on those decisions. The combat occurred not in physical space but in cognitive space. British deception creating false beliefs, German intelligence attempting to determine truth from falsity, each side trying to understand what the other was doing while preventing the other from understanding what they were doing. This was warfare as information competition. Britain won engagements not by destroying German aircraft or preventing German attacks, but by making those attacks less effective through manipulation of the information German forces used to make targeting decisions. The principle extends far beyond dummy airfields to characterize much of modern conflict. Military forces increasingly compete in information environments where perception, belief, and understanding become battlegrounds as important as physical terrain. The side that better controls information, that can make adversaries believe false things or doubt true things, gains advantages that conventional military capabilities alone might not provide. The Luftwaffe pilots who attacked dummy installations weren't less skilled or courageous than pilots who attacked genuine targets. They were operating with systematically falsified information that made their skill and courage serve British objectives rather than German ones. Their attacks succeeded perfectly, hitting targets, delivering ordnance accurately, while achieving nothing because the targets themselves were false. This is the unsettling lesson the program demonstrates. That in modern warfare, success in execution can be strategically meaningless if the objectives themselves are false, if the enemy has manipulated the information you're using to determine what objectives matter. The bombs fell exactly where German planners intended. The missions succeeded exactly as briefed. Intelligence assessments accurately reported damage. And none of it mattered because all of it was based on fundamentally false understanding of what was being attacked. 2,000 bombs, perhaps more, expended against targets that existed only to be attacked. Missions flown, risks taken, resources consumed, all to destroy installations that had no military value except their capacity to draw exactly these attacks away from installations that did have value. The dummy airfields didn't win the Battle of Britain by themselves. Radar, fighter pilot skill, intelligence from signals intercepts, industrial production, all these contributed to British survival during this critical period. But the deception program created marginal advantages during a time when margins determined outcomes. German forces attacked targets that didn't exist. They assessed damage that didn't matter. They celebrated successes that served their enemies' objectives. And they continued doing so even after discovering the deception existed, because they couldn't reliably distinguish false from genuine without expending the very effort the deception was designed to waste. The fields that weren't really fields fought back against attacks that achieved nothing. The installations that weren't really installations defended the installations that were real by being sufficiently convincing that enemy forces attacked them instead. The invisible weapon was perfectly visible from 3,000 feet. It just wasn't what it appeared to be. And in warfare, in strategy, in conflict between thinking adversaries, appearance can be more powerful than reality, if you control what appears and understand how adversaries will interpret those appearances. Axis pilots ignored Churchill's dummy airfields eventually. But by then they'd already wasted over 2,000 bombs on them. The deception had succeeded not despite being discovered, but through the process of being discovered, making German forces expend effort to determine what was false while protecting what was genuine, creating uncertainty that persisted even after the deception's existence was known, achieving defensive objectives through offensive manipulation of enemy perception and belief. The fields won not by fighting but by being fought over. And that victory, subtle, invisible except through careful analysis, achieved through construction crews and set designers rather than soldiers, was as genuine as any victory won through conventional combat. More genuine, perhaps, because it required no destruction beyond the enemy's false beliefs about what was being destroyed.